Good morning and welcome to Rising. We are serving up a spectacular show for you today. Batya Ungar-Sargon is back with us to kick off the week. So nice to see you, Batya.
It's so great to be here with you, Robby. Thank you for having me. And we have a great lineup today. Liz Wolfe will break down how fact checkers are covering for the White House's IRS claims. And Dr. Payal Patel will discuss a polio outbreak happening in New York's wastewater.
But first, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has railed against woke ideology as he campaigned for Republicans in Pennsylvania and Ohio over the weekend.
We can't just stand idly by while woke ideology ravages every institution in our society. We must fight the woke in our schools. We must fight the woke in our businesses. We must fight the woke in government agencies. We can never, ever surrender to woke ideology. And I'll tell you this, the state of Florida is where woke goes to die.
Tomorrow, Florida will hold elections for school board races, which typically don't receive much attention, but according to Business Insider, DeSantis has taken note of the energy behind these local elections and has moved to restrict school curriculum on race, gender, and sexual orientation.
Meanwhile, former Florida State Attorney Andrew Warren, who is currently suing DeSantis for suspending him, had this to say on MSNBC.
And we should be so concerned for the sake of our democracy, for people who are only willing to follow the rule of law and only willing to follow the Constitution when it's convenient, who are only willing to do so when it serves their own political interests, when it fits with their own political narrative. You know, true patriots support the rule of law and the Constitution at all times. And that's not what's happening here.
You know, it's interesting,
Robby.
though, for some of this, I feel like that is what's happening. It's clear that so many voters, not just conservatives, but many independents, some people who would vote Democrat on other issues, agree that, you know, whatever you want to call it, woke is a very funny word, but whatever you want to call it, this identity politics, political correctness, the overemphasis on using perfect language relating to sex and gender, etc., that majorities of people don't want this being taught in schools or in a sort of activist, you know, you're forced to comply with it sort of way for young kids. And they don't want it infecting the government, and even as consumers, as customers, they've rejected it to some extent when businesses do it, when programming decisions are being made by Netflix or HBO or something, or Disney on a let's not offend people kind of way. Right? The people are speaking as consumers, to some degree, as participants in a democratic voter system, and they are saying they don't like it, and that's part of Ron DeSantis' success, right?
Yeah, so I sort of, there is two sides to this, right? On the one hand, certainly the fight on wokeness can veer into sketchy First Amendment territory. On the other hand, we are all perfectly comfortable saying there are certain things you cannot say in the classroom, you cannot say in the workplace, and we understand that you know, those restrictions are actually part of having, you know, a free and open society, right? So there is a push and pull here. I have not seen DeSantis yet veer too far, onto the stage of coming into conflict with the First Amendment. But of course, we should be on the lookout for that potentially. I want to define how I define wokeness, and then I want you to define it, Robby, because that is a critique that a lot of people on the left will often say, like, oh, you just use wokeness when you don't want to talk about important issues of race and gender and sexuality. But I don't think that's not how I define it. I define it as, you know, the impulse that makes white liberals, a study in 2018 found, a Yale study, that white liberals dumb down their vocabulary when talking to Black and Hispanic Americans, right? The impulse that makes you see people of color or people who have a different sexuality or sexual orientation or gender identity than you, makes you see them as inherently disempowered, inherently marginalized, inherently having less agency than you, and thus your entire approach to them should be one of a sort of of patronizing attempt to uplift them, right? That's the sort of equity model, right? That people coming in, we're not all coming in with the same advantages, and therefore we have to amend society to cater to the marginalized in a way that is, I think very problematic constitutionally, certainly very problematic from the point of view of what Dr. King's vision for America was. And I think it's very bad. And so when I see DeSantis standing up to this, I agree with you, Robby. I think a lot of people on both sides of the political aisle, they really reject this viewpoint, which comes straight out of academia and is very alien to the progress that we've made as a nation in terms of overcoming things like racism and sexism. Of course, we haven't fully overcome these things, but we're getting really close, and we've made such progress. And this is really the woke ideology, to me, is really overreach on the part of the left, beyond the vision that Dr. King and that our Constitution laid out, right, that we've been sort of progressing towards. How do you define wokeness?
Yeah, I similarly think of it as an ideology that places a high degree of importance on correcting language relating to race and gender. I think more broadly, we're talking about people, about an academic philosophy that sees people mostly as, like, the unit of the person is oppression. You are a set of overlapping oppression categories, and that describes how you are. It's not enough to be an individual. You are, well, what is your racial category? What is your gender identity? How have you been oppressed because of your sexuality or your age or your ability status or your access to material wealth and or your mental health? And all of those things together makes you who you are. And I think it's a very kind of sad way of looking at people, and also promotes what I've noticed in activist circles, especially on college campuses. It encourages people to look for oppression, to look for ways in which they've been deprivileged because being the most oppressed and the most deprivileged gives you authority and power in these circles. So people go looking for reasons to describe themselves as miserable in effect. And this is why there's so much of this kind of, I think, mental health trauma language and actual, like, feigned mental health among young people, among very progressive young people, because describing yourself that way is a way to appeal to these oppression narratives. Say, well, I'm depressed, I suffer from post-traumatic stress, etc. And it's not no dynamic that causes people to want to associate themselves with mental illness. It's by definition not healthy. So that's my view of it.
Yeah, it's very sad, because I think a lot of them actually do end up manifesting real symptoms of mental illness because of exactly the what you're describing. That view of, you are defined by your oppression, right? That sort of comes out of that, Hegelian, Marxist, critical theory, critical race theory, academic way of thinking that does reduce, the world into oppressor versus oppressed. And on that topic of critical race theory, DeSantis explained to his followers the reasoning for his ban. Let's watch that.
But I think the left tries to portray American history as it being founded because of slavery, and that this was something that, the founders were really holding up about what the country was about. Actually, a lot of them were embarrassed that this was something that was there. Even people like Washington, who owned freed slaves. Jefferson would always, he agonized about slavery, and I know he participated in it, but he recognized that it was wrong. So intellectually, you had very few of the revolutionary generation make a compelling positive case for slavery. What these people, though, are doing on the left, they're basically taking the position Stephen Douglas took when he debated Lincoln in 1858. I mean, Douglas was saying, hey, no, the Constitution is about slavery, and he supported the Dred Scott decision. Lincoln was on the other side of that. He said this was a country conceived in liberty. It doesn't happen overnight. This is a fight that you have to keep fighting, but that's what he believed. So we're teaching the accurate history, and we're basically teaching it from the perspective of a Lincoln or a Frederick Douglass rather than a Stephen Douglas.
It's so hard. You can't picture Trump ever talking that way. You know what I mean? It's like just to be so steeped in our history and in these conversations. So one school district, though, is in Florida's Palm Beach County, was reportedly reviewing their classroom books ahead of the school year for, quote, sexism, racism, and oppression as part of the district's effort to comply with state laws, right? So here you see again how this can become problematic, right? When you have, a really good idea, let's say, I think we agree, right? The idea of like limiting the impact of wokeness, but then you end up having sort of like down ballot, lower tier administrators trying to implement this, right? And you get things that maybe are not, like as a high concept, high level as one would want.
Well, and I should note, I mean, a federal judge has blocked, this happened a few days ago, did block the implementation of Florida's Stop Woke Act. It's literally called that, on grounds that it does run up against the First Amendment, and I knew this was going to be an issue, when you're telling businesses, what they can put in their training materials, or the businesses are private entities, so the government limiting their speech is such an obvious violation of the First Amendment. Conservatives really got to get that through their head. It's funny, and it's both funny and frustrating to kind of reteach some Republicans that, look, you might not like what these companies do. I criticize them all the time as well. But by definition, what the First Amendment prohibits is exactly what you're doing, which is the government telling them, so that's different if we're talking about the government itself, we can limit wokeness or identity politics or whatever we're calling it. The schools is somewhere in the middle because it's fraught, because there are, students have First Amendment rights, and there's some, academic freedom in colleges very strongly. That there's a tradition of that. In K through 12, it's a little less clearly defined by law. So that's where there's going to be debates over. I think the better approach, rather than Republicans seizing control of government and then forcing all these entities to not do problematic speech or speech they don't like, that requires you to win like every time, right? Rather than do that, we should just get rid of government agencies that aren't important anyway, or just give people, to the extent it's a problem in schools, I would just give kids more options, like can't do more school choice, more vouchers, more of those things that instead of trying to control every school and say they have to teach this, just say, parents to say, this school, I don't like what they teach. Good, go to this other school. You can get whatever money the state's investing your tax dollars on this school, use it in that school instead. That's a better. That doesn't require us to win every election, because then all of these things become these zero-sum contests where you have to win every time over and over again. And I'd rather change the system.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. To me, I look at this less as a legislative victory than a political victory, right? What DeSantis is doing is laying out an alternative to the woke capture of our institutions by the left. And in that sense, he doesn't have to win, right? If the legislature comes down on him and says, you can't do this, he still won, right? He still took that position.
Politically, yes.
Exactly.
Yes,
he
absolutely.
took that stand and said, look, we're not going to sit passively by, right? It doesn't have to win every time. And it is interesting because if you look at what Trump did, he banned DEI trainings within government institutions, right? So it was a much more limited, right, but successful legislatively, right, attempt to control this. Whereas on the other hand, you have DeSantis taking a much bigger swing. But I do think this has been a big political windfall for him, and he doesn't have to win every time to make the statement that this is where we're at.
Well, on the opposite side of the spectrum, New York Governor Kathy Hochul recently signed a new law that bans gendered language for professions, quote, jobs have no gender, but unfortunately many of our state's laws still use gendered language, the bill reads, and replaces words like councilman or councilmen to council members or to council member or council member instead of council, councilman, councilwoman. Look, this is I think it's kind of silly, and to the extent they're always making, so I saw one of the changes was from inmate to incarcerated persons. That just seems silly because it takes so much longer to say and write that. And the point of language is to preserve time, to preserve meaning and preserve time. If you make every word 10 syllables longer, you're not necessarily doing a lot of good. That said, some of these, sure, they're outdated statutes. I guess I don't really care if they get changed. I don't care either way. And I think it would be very silly to say this is an important, pressing issue for the government to tackle and address. But fine, if they want to change what the term is in some old documents, I don't really care. What do you think?
I remember when I first read the 1619 Project, and they had made the decision to refer to slaves as enslaved persons. And I remember thinking, that's a really important shift. You know, like the work that's done when you add the word person to enslaved person, I think is just, it's really important. It really reminds you every time you discuss this that these were people whose lives were stolen from them and whose personhood was stolen from them, right? And you don't recapitulate that theft in speaking about it. And I remember thinking, I'm so glad that this happened. And now you're seeing more and more people sort of speaking that way. I try to make sure that I speak that way. I do it in my writing. And you're seeing more and more people across the political spectrum speaking in that way. And I think that that kind of a cultural, a cultural shift is very, very important. I don't know if you can have achieve the same effect by imposing it from above, right? I mean, we're not going to be reading documents that say, from the right, like internal government documents about inmates versus incarcerated persons. But, so like you, I feel like there's sort of, I could see both sides of this, but I really, if you had said to me before, oh, we should change the way we talk about slaves, I don't know that I would have said, oh, yes, that's very important. But now that I sort of saw the impact it had on my own writing, on my own thinking, I'm more sympathetic to efforts to sort of give people back their humanity, in little ways.
I like that change. I agree with you on that one. I'm just wary overall of this kind of evolution. It's something George Carlin, the comedian, warned about in a really great routine that I've referenced, that I think I've played part of on the show before, where he talks about how the combat condition that started out as shell shock over time has become a post-traumatic stress disorder. So you make it longer, make it softer, make it sound less harsh. And he thinks there's something about not then treating the actual problem if you feel like you've gotten the wording more precise and more elaborate. Which I thought was a good lesson to learn. So
yeah,
we'll
absolutely.
See about some of these.
If that's your number one issue, is thinking about the words and the terms as opposed to the issues themselves,
right,
you do risk. So I'm just thinking to myself, like, are we being hypocrites here, saying what DeSantis is doing is important in fighting wokeness, right? But what Hochul is doing is not important in terms of her sort of try. So I'm wary of that, right? This question of whether things should be happening legislatively or politically.
Yeah. All right, we'll tell you what's on our radars coming up next. Stay with us.